In the winter of 1899, Kansas experienced the most brutal cold in recorded history. Temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees F and snow buried entire homesteads for months. But in the small town of Hayes, something far more chilling than the weather was happening behind the doors of the Parker Brothers warehouse. When spring finally arrived and the snow melted, investigators discovered discrepancies in the county death records that would haunt them for decades. Over 300 families had supposedly died during that harsh winter, yet only 47 bodies were ever found in the town cemetery. The rest had simply vanished without a trace. What the Parker brothers were burning in their industrial furnaces wasn't just wood or coal. It was evidence of the most systematic and calculating crime spree in Kansas history, hidden beneath the guise of Christian charity and community service. Before we uncover the disturbing truth about what Thomas and Samuel Parker did during those frozen months, I want you to know that this story contains details that have been buried in county archives for over a century. If you're fascinated by true crime stories that blur the line between fact and legend, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. I'd love to know how far this story reaches. The documents I'm about to share with you were discovered in a water-damaged basement in Hayes County Courthouse. And what they reveal will change how you think about survival, desperation, and the dark side of human nature. The year 1899 began with promise for the residents of Hayes, Kansas. This railroad town of roughly 8,000 souls had weathered previous harsh winters, and the community prided itself on neighborly cooperation and Christian values. The town sat strategically along the Kansas Pacific Railway, which brought both prosperity and a steady stream of settlers looking to claim their piece of the American frontier. Main Street bustled with activity. The general store, the bank, 3 churches, and dozens of businesses that served the surrounding farming communities. But Hayes was also a town built on the edge of the unknown. Just 30 miles west lay the beginning of what locals called the empty lands, vast stretches of prairie where homesteaders had claimed isolated plots, often miles from their nearest neighbors. These brave families had built their lives in sod houses and wooden shanties, depending entirely on their own resourcefulness and the occasional supply runs to town for survival. Thomas and Samuel Parker had arrived in Hayes 5 years earlier, in 1894, with enough capital to purchase a large warehouse on the outskirts of town. The brothers, then in their early 32nd, presented themselves as entrepreneurs with a vision for serving the growing community. Thomas, the older brother, was tall and lean with prematurely gray hair and the kind of piercing blue eyes that seemed to assess the value of everything they looked upon. Samuel was shorter, stockier, with calloused hands and a perpetual smile that never quite reached his eyes. Their business model was simple yet essential. They provided cleaning and estate services for families in crisis. When homesteaders died from accidents, disease, or the harsh realities of frontier life, the Parker brothers would step in to handle the difficult aftermath. They would travel to the deceased family's property, remove bodies for proper burial, inventory, and sell personal belongings, clean the homestead, and prepare it for new occupants. In a time when death was common and resources were scarce, their services filled a crucial need. The brothers had built a reputation for discretion and efficiency. They owned 2 heavy wagons, employed several part-time workers, and maintained one of the few large furnaces in the area. Originally installed to process salvage materials and dispose of unsellable items, local families trusted them to handle their most difficult moments with dignity and respect. As autumn turned to winter in 1899, few could have predicted that nature was about to deliver the most devastating blow in Kansas history. The first snows arrived in early November, weeks earlier than usual. By December, temperatures had dropped to levels that old-timers claimed they'd never experienced. The railroad lines became unreliable. Supply runs to isolated homesteads grew dangerous, and the town of Hayes found itself increasingly cut off from the outside world. But Thomas and Samuel Parker saw opportunity where others saw catastrophe. They had survived previous winters by adapting their methods, and they possessed resources that most of their neighbors lacked. What nobody realized was that the brothers had been slowly refining their approach to their macabre business, finding ways to extract maximum profit from human tragedy. The brutal winter of 1899 would provide them with unprecedented opportunities to perfect their methods. The first sign that this winter would be different came on the 18th of November, 899 when the temperature dropped 30 degrees overnight. Sarah Henderson, who ran the telegraph office, later wrote in her diary that she had never seen ice form so quickly on the windows. By morning, the town square was buried under 18 inches of snow, and the wind was howling with a ferocity that made conversation impossible outdoors. Within days, the railroad announced that service would be suspended indefinitely. Supply wagons from the east stopped arriving, and the families scattered across the prairie found themselves completely isolated. The Parker brothers, however, seemed remarkably well prepared for the crisis. Their warehouse was stocked with coal, preserved foods, and warm clothing. They had arranged for their furnace to be converted to burn multiple types of fuel, and they possessed the only reliable winter transportation in the area, a specially reinforced sled designed to navigate through deep snow. As December progressed, the situation grew desperate. Families began appearing at the Parker brothers' warehouse, seeking help with heating, fuel, food, or transportation to town. Thomas and Samuel welcomed these visitors with apparent compassion, offering assistance and shelter. However, those who worked closely with the brothers began to notice subtle changes in their behavior. Mary Kellerman, who served as the town's informal record keeper, later testified that the Parker brothers visited her office repeatedly during December, asking detailed questions about property ownership, inheritance laws, and the procedures for transferring land titles. They claimed to be planning ahead for the estate services they would likely need to provide once the winter ended. At the time, Mary thought their preparation was admirable. Only later would she realize the true purpose of their inquiries. The brothers also began making regular visits to isolated homesteads, ostensibly to check on families and offer assistance. They would arrive with supplies, warm clothing, and cheerful conversation. But according to witness accounts discovered decades later, these visits often preceded mysterious disappearances. The Kowalski family, who lived 12 miles north of Hayes, was visited by the Parker brothers on the 14th of December. Neighbors found their homestead abandoned 3 days later, with no sign of where the family had gone. The brothers claimed they had helped the Kowalskis relocate to relatives in Missouri, but no such relatives were ever found. As Christmas approached, the temperature reached an unthinkable low of -38 degrees. The town's population began to dwindle as families either fled east or simply vanished. The Parker brothers, meanwhile, seemed to thrive in the chaos. Their furnace burned continuously, sending thick black smoke into the gray sky. The smell that emanated from their warehouse was unlike anything the townspeople had experienced before. A sickly, sweet odor that seemed to cling to clothing and linger in the nostrils. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the town's physician, made several attempts to investigate the source of the smell. Each time he approached the warehouse, however, he was politely but firmly turned away by the brothers, who claimed they were burning contaminated materials from homes where families had died of disease. Given the circumstances, Dr. Hartwell accepted this explanation, though he noted in his medical journal that the odor was unlike any disease-related material I have encountered in my practice. By New Year's Day, 1900, the situation had become surreal. The town of Hayes, which had boasted 8,000 residents just 2 months earlier, now seemed to house fewer than 2,000 souls. The Parker brothers claimed that most families had either died from the cold or fled to warmer regions. They had taken on the massive task of processing abandoned properties, working day and night to salvage what they could and prepare homes for eventual resettlement. But a few observant residents began to notice troubling patterns. Properties that had been abandoned were somehow being transferred to new owners with unusual speed. Valuable items from deceased families were appearing in the brothers' warehouse for sale, often within days of the supposed deaths. Most disturbing of all, the brothers seemed to have an uncanny ability to predict which families would disappear next. The first person to voice serious concerns about the Parker brothers was Janet Thornfield, a widow who ran a small boarding house near the center of town. Janet had lived in Hayes for over 20 years and prided herself on knowing every family within a 50-mile radius. As the winter deepened, she began keeping detailed notes about the families who had supposedly died or fled. Her records, discovered in 1962 during the renovation of her former boarding house, paint a disturbing picture of systematic deception. According to Janet's notes, the Parker brothers were reporting family deaths at a rate that defied statistical probability. During the months of December and January, they claim to have processed the estates of 43 families, ranging from elderly couples to families with young children. Yet Janet's careful observations revealed that many of these families had been in good health and possessed adequate supplies when she had last seen them. The Brennan family, for example, had visited Janet's boarding house on the 20th of December, appearing well-fed and in good spirits. Mrs. Brennan had even purchased supplies for what she described as a comfortable winter in their homestead. Yet 5 days later, the Parker brothers reported that the entire family had frozen to death in their home. When Janet asked to pay her respects at the funeral, she was told that the bodies had been too badly damaged by the cold for a proper viewing and had been buried immediately. Similar discrepancies surrounded the fate of the Williamson family, the Krause family, and nearly a dozen others. In each case, the Parker brothers provided reasonable explanations for the deaths and handled all arrangements with apparent professionalism. But Janet's notes reveal a pattern of healthy families suddenly vanishing, followed by the rapid liquidation of their properties and possessions. Janet's suspicions deepened when she witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. On the evening of the 15th of January, 1900, she was walking past the Parker brothers' warehouse when she heard voices coming from inside. Through a gap in the wooden siding, she glimpsed what appeared to be a family, a man, woman, and 2 children standing near the furnace. The family seemed to be in distress, and Thomas Parker was speaking to them in low, urgent tones. Janet couldn't make out the words, but she clearly heard the woman crying and one of the children asking, "When can we go home?" Janet waited for nearly an hour, expecting to see the family emerge from the warehouse. Instead, she heard the furnace door open and close several times, followed by the sound of heavy objects being moved. When she finally worked up the courage to look through the gap again, she saw only Thomas and Samuel Parker working methodically to feed materials into the furnace. The family was nowhere to be seen. The next morning, Janet inquired discreetly about the family she had seen. The description she provided matched the Hendricks family, who had been reported as frozen to death in their homestead 2 days earlier. When Janet expressed confusion about having seen them alive the previous evening, she was told that she must have been mistaken. Grief and worry, the brothers explained sympathetically, could play tricks on the mind during such difficult times. But Janet was certain of what she had witnessed. She began paying closer attention to the Parker brothers' activities, watching their comings and goings, and noting the patterns of their behavior. What she discovered was a level of organization and efficiency that seemed impossible for legitimate estate services. The brothers worked with the precision of men who had perfected their methods through extensive practice, through careful observation, and later testimony from surviving witnesses. A picture emerged of how the Parker brothers had transformed their legitimate business into something far more sinister. Their approach was methodical, calculated, and designed to exploit both the desperation of winter and the trust of their community. The brothers had developed what could only be described as a systematic process for acquiring and disposing of properties and their owners. They would begin by identifying vulnerable families, those who lived in isolation, had valuable possessions, or lacked strong connections to the broader community. They would then make contact under the guise of offering assistance, using their reputation and resources to gain the family's trust. Once they had established a relationship, the brothers would gradually increase the family's dependence on their services. They would provide heating, fuel, food, and transportation, always presenting themselves as generous benefactors. However, according to evidence discovered later, they were actually creating conditions that made the families more vulnerable and isolated. The brothers had acquired detailed knowledge of property law and inheritance procedures, allowing them to forge documents and manipulate official records. They had also developed relationships with key individuals in the county administration, providing them with advanced notice of property transfers and legal proceedings. Most importantly, they had perfected methods for disposing of evidence that would leave no trace of their activities. When the time came to eliminate a family, the brothers would lure them to the warehouse under some pretext, often claiming they needed help with estate matters or had found relatives who could provide assistance. Once the family was inside the warehouse, they would be overpowered and killed. The brothers had designed their furnace to burn at extremely high temperatures, allowing them to dispose of bodies completely while simultaneously destroying any personal effects that might be traced. The genius of their system was that it operated within the context of legitimate business activities. The brothers were known to be estate cleaners and property processors, so the presence of personal belongings in their warehouse was entirely normal. The constant operation of their furnace was explained as necessary for disposing of contaminated materials and unsellable items. Even the smell that emanated from their operations could be attributed to burning organic materials from abandoned homes. Dr. Hartwell's medical journal, discovered in 1978, provides additional insight into the brothers' methods. The doctor noted that during the winter of 1899-1900, he was never called to examine any of the bodies that the Parker brothers claimed to have found. In all cases, he was told that the bodies had been too badly damaged by cold or disease to warrant medical examination. This was highly unusual, as Dr. Hartwell was normally involved in determining cause of death for insurance and legal purposes. The brothers had also developed an efficient system for liquidating stolen property. They would sort through the belongings of their victims, keeping valuable items for later sale, and burning anything that might be traced to specific individuals. They maintained detailed inventories of their acquisitions, which they would later claim represented legitimate purchases or salvage operations. Most disturbing of all, the brothers seem to have developed psychological mechanisms for justifying their actions. In letters discovered in Thomas Parker's personal effects, he described their activities as mercy work and claimed they were relieving families of the suffering they would endure during the harsh winter. Samuel Parker's diary, found decades later, contains entries suggesting that he genuinely believed they were providing a service to the community by preventing slow deaths from starvation and freezing. By mid-January 1900, the Parker brothers had reached the peak of their efficiency. The temperature had not risen above -20 degrees in over 3 weeks, and the town of Hayes was essentially cut off from the outside world. Under these conditions, the brothers operated with almost complete impunity, confident that their activities would go unnoticed and uninvestigated. During this period, they processed what they later claimed were the estates of over 60 families. The mathematical impossibility of this number should have raised immediate suspicions, but the extreme conditions made normal oversight impossible. The county courthouse was often inaccessible due to snow. The railroad remained suspended, and communication with state authorities was virtually impossible. The brothers had also refined their selection process to focus on families with the most valuable properties and possessions. They maintained detailed records of land ownership, livestock holdings, and stored goods, allowing them to prioritize their targets based on potential profit. They had developed the ability to forge property transfer documents with remarkable skill, often completing transactions that would have required weeks of legal proceedings under normal circumstances. Evidence suggests that during the peak period, the brothers were processing multiple families per week. Their warehouse operated around the clock, with the furnace burning continuously and workers moving materials in and out at all hours. The brothers had recruited several accomplices from among the town's desperate residents, offering food and shelter in exchange for assistance with their estate services. These accomplices, who were likely unaware of the full scope of the brothers' activities, provided crucial testimony when the truth was finally revealed. They described a warehouse filled with personal belongings, furniture, and household goods from dozens of families. They witnessed the brothers sorting through clothes, toys, and personal items with the efficiency of experienced merchants. Most tellingly, they reported that the brothers maintained detailed lists of names, addresses, and property descriptions that they updated constantly. One accomplice, a man named Frank Collar, later testified that he had been employed to help move salvage materials from the warehouse to the furnace. He described carrying bundles of clothing, furniture, and what he believed to be contaminated bedding from abandoned homes. However, he noted that many of the items appeared to be in excellent condition, and some seemed to contain personal effects that families would never have left behind voluntarily. Frank also reported that the brothers maintained strict control over access to certain areas of the warehouse. There were rooms that workers were forbidden to enter, and times when all employees were required to leave the premises entirely. The brothers explained these restrictions as necessary for handling contaminated materials or processing sensitive estate documents. But Frank later realized that these were likely the times when the brothers were disposing of bodies. The efficiency of the operation was matched by its secrecy. The brothers had developed an elaborate system of explanations and cover stories for every aspect of their activities. They maintained correspondence with fictional relatives of deceased families, created fake departure notices for families who had supposedly fled to other states, and even arranged for periodic letters from families who were supposedly alive and well in distant locations. The first crack in the Parker brothers' seemingly perfect system came from an unexpected source, a child's toy that should have been burned months earlier. On the 14th of February, 1900, a young girl named Emma Schultz was playing near the warehouse when she discovered a small wooden horse partially buried in the snow. The toy was hand-carved and bore the initials PB. Peter Brennan, the 6-year-old son of the family that had supposedly frozen to death in December. Emma brought the toy to her mother, who immediately recognized it as belonging to the Brennan family. Mrs. Schultz had seen Peter playing with the horse just days before the family's reported death, and she knew that it was his most prized possession. The idea that the toy would have been left behind or discarded seemed impossible. Peter would never have parted with it voluntarily. Mrs. Schultz shared her concerns with Janet Thornfield, who had been quietly documenting her own suspicions about the Parker brothers. Together, they began to investigate more systematically, comparing notes and observations about the families that had supposedly died or fled during the winter. What they discovered was a pattern of discrepancies that could not be explained by coincidence or confusion. The two women realized that they needed help, but approaching the local authorities seemed impossible. The sheriff, Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan, no relation to the deceased family, was overwhelmed by the crisis and had been relying heavily on the Parker brothers' reports about deaths and disappearances. The county judge was effectively unreachable due to the snow, and the state authorities were dealing with similar crises throughout Kansas. Instead, Janet and Mrs. Schultz decided to recruit other concerned residents to help with their investigation. They approached Dr. Hartwell, who had been troubled by his inability to examine any of the bodies the brothers claimed to have found. They also contacted Mary Kellerman, the record keeper, who had been uncomfortable with the brothers' repeated inquiries about property laws and inheritance procedures. This small group of investigators began meeting secretly to compare their observations and document their concerns. They discovered that each of them had noticed different aspects of the Parker brothers' suspicious behavior, but when combined, the evidence painted a disturbing picture of systematic deception and possible criminal activity. Dr. Hartwell contributed medical expertise, noting that the reported causes of death were often inconsistent with the supposed circumstances. Mary Kellerman provided insight into the legal irregularities surrounding property transfers and estate settlements. Janet Thornfield offered detailed observations about the brothers' activities and schedules. Mrs. Schultz contributed her knowledge of the families involved and their personal circumstances. Together, they began to piece together a timeline of events that challenged every aspect of the brothers' official account. They identified families who had supposedly died, but whose circumstances made death unlikely. They documented property transfers that had occurred with impossible speed. They noted the absence of bodies, funerals, and the normal procedures that should have accompanied so many deaths. Most importantly, they began to develop a theory about what might actually be happening to the missing families. The constant operation of the furnace, the strange odors, the brothers' access to isolated families, and the systematic nature of the disappearances all pointed to a conclusion that was almost too horrible to contemplate. Armed with their evidence and growing certainty about the Parker brothers' crimes, the group of investigators faced a crucial decision. They could continue gathering evidence and hope that spring would bring outside authorities who could conduct a proper investigation, or they could take immediate action to prevent further deaths. The decision was made for them when they learned that the brothers were planning to visit the Kowalski family, one of the last remaining isolated homesteads in the area. On the evening of the 22nd of February, 1900, Dr. Hartwell and Janet Thornfield decided to follow the Parker brothers on their visit to the Kowalski family. They traveled by sled, staying far enough behind to avoid detection, but close enough to observe the brothers' activities. What they witnessed would provide the final confirmation of their worst fears. The brothers arrived at the Kowalski homestead around sunset, carrying supplies and presenting themselves as concerned neighbors. They were welcomed warmly by the family who had been isolated for weeks and were grateful for the contact. Dr. Hartwell and Janet watched from a distance as the brothers entered the home and spent several hours inside. Around midnight, the brothers emerged from the house with the Kowalski family, parents, and 3 children. The family appeared to be carrying personal belongings and seemed to be preparing for travel. The brothers loaded the family into their sled and began the journey back toward town. Dr. Hartwell and Janet followed at a safe distance, expecting to see the family delivered to safety in Hayes. Instead, the brothers' sled went directly to their warehouse. The family was led inside and the building was secured. Dr. Hartwell and Janet waited for hours, expecting to see the family emerge. But by dawn there was no sign of them. The only activity was the continuous operation of the furnace, which seemed to be burning with unusual intensity. Convinced that they had witnessed the abduction of the Kowalski family, Dr. Hartwell and Janet returned to town to gather their fellow investigators. They realized that they could no longer wait for outside authorities. They had to act immediately to save the Kowalski family and prevent further deaths. The group decided to confront the Parker brothers directly, demanding an explanation for the Kowalski family's disappearance and presenting their evidence of the brothers' suspicious activities. They approached the warehouse on the morning of the 23rd of February. Armed with their documentation and prepared for a confrontation, Thomas Parker met them at the warehouse door, maintaining his characteristic calm demeanor. When asked about the Kowalski family, he explained that they had been suffering from severe frostbite and malnutrition, and that he and Samuel had transported them to relatives in Junction City. He provided detailed explanations for all of the investigators' concerns, dismissing their evidence as misunderstandings and coincidences. However, Dr. Hartwell made a crucial observation during this confrontation. As Thomas Parker spoke, the doctor noticed stains on the man's clothing that appeared to be blood. When he pointed this out, Thomas claimed that he had been butchering livestock for food preparation. But Dr. Hartwell, with his medical training, recognized that the stains were consistent with human blood rather than animal blood. The confrontation escalated when Janet Thornfield demanded to search the warehouse for evidence of the Kowalski family's presence. Thomas Parker refused, claiming that the building contained sensitive materials and contaminated items that could pose health risks. However, his refusal only heightened the investigators' suspicions and convinced them that their worst fears were justified. Unable to gain voluntary access to the warehouse, the group of investigators decided to involve what remained of the local authorities. They approached Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan, presenting their evidence and demanding an official investigation. Initially skeptical, Brennan was eventually convinced by the accumulation of evidence and the urgency of the situation. On the 25th of February, 1900, Deputy Marshal Brennan, accompanied by Dr. Hartwell and 3 other volunteers, forced entry into the Parker brothers' warehouse. What they found inside would become the subject of official reports, criminal proceedings, and decades of investigation. The warehouse was divided into several sections, each serving a different purpose in the brothers' operation. The main area contained hundreds of personal items, clothing, furniture, tools, and household goods organized with meticulous care. Each item was catalogued and tagged, suggesting a systematic approach to inventory management. In a separate room, the investigators found detailed records of the brothers' activities. These documents included property maps, family information, financial records, and correspondence related to estate transactions. The level of detail was staggering. The brothers had maintained comprehensive files on virtually every family in the area, including information about their resources, vulnerabilities, and potential value. Most disturbing were the personal effects that should have been buried with the deceased families. The investigators found jewelry, family photographs, religious items, and other possessions that families would never have parted with voluntarily. These items were sorted and catalogued like merchandise, with notes indicating their estimated value and potential for resale. The furnace area provided the most horrifying evidence. The brothers had modified their furnace to burn at extremely high temperatures, capable of completely consuming organic materials. Around the furnace, the investigators found bone fragments, partially burned clothing, and other remains that suggested the brothers had been using the furnace to dispose of human bodies. Dr. Hartwell collected samples of the bone fragments and other organic materials for analysis. His medical examination confirmed that the remains were human, representing multiple individuals of different ages. The doctor estimated that the furnace had been used to dispose of dozens of bodies, possibly over 100 during the winter months. The investigators also discovered evidence of the brothers' most recent activities. In a locked room, they found the personal belongings of the Kowalski family, including the children's toys and the parents' clothing. The items were arranged as if they had been recently sorted and catalogued, suggesting that the family had been processed within the past few days. Most chilling of all was a journal kept by Samuel Parker, which contained detailed descriptions of the brothers' methods and philosophy. The journal revealed that the brothers had gradually developed their system over several years, perfecting their techniques and justifying their actions through a twisted logic of mercy and efficiency. When confronted with the evidence found in their warehouse, the Parker brothers initially attempted to maintain their innocence, claiming that they had been operating a legitimate estate service and that any irregularities were the result of the extreme conditions of the winter. However, the overwhelming physical evidence and the testimony of witnesses made their guilt impossible to deny. Thomas Parker, the older brother, eventually provided a partial confession in exchange for assurance that his younger brother would be spared execution. His confession revealed the full scope of their activities and provided details about their methods, motivations, and the number of families they had killed. According to Thomas's confession, the brothers had eliminated 47 families during the winter of 1899-1900, representing approximately 200 individual victims. They had begun their activities as a response to the extreme conditions initially targeting families who were already close to death from cold and starvation. However, as their system became more refined and profitable, they had begun actively seeking out healthy families with valuable properties. The brothers had developed sophisticated methods for luring families to their warehouse, often claiming that they had found relatives who could provide assistance or that they needed help with estate matters. Once the families were inside the warehouse, they would be overpowered and killed, usually by suffocation or blunt force trauma to avoid creating blood evidence. The bodies were then processed through their modified furnace, which could completely consume human remains within several hours. Personal belongings were sorted and catalogued, with valuable items kept for resale and everything else destroyed. The brothers had created an elaborate system of false documentation to explain the family's disappearances and to facilitate the transfer of their properties. Samuel Parker, the younger brother, provided additional details about their psychological state during the winter. He described how they had gradually become desensitized to the killing, viewing it as a necessary business function rather than murder. He claimed that they had convinced themselves that they were providing a service to the community by preventing slow deaths from starvation and freezing. The brothers' trial became one of the most notorious criminal proceedings in Kansas history. The evidence against them was overwhelming, including physical remains, documented confessions, and testimony from multiple witnesses. The trial revealed the full scope of their crimes and provided insight into the psychological mechanisms that had allowed them to commit such systematic murders. Both brothers were convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. However, the legal proceedings were complicated by questions about jurisdiction, the extreme circumstances of the winter, and the challenges of proving specific crimes when so much evidence had been destroyed. The discovery of the Parker brothers' crimes sent shockwaves through Kansas and the broader region. The systematic nature of their murders, the sophisticated methods they had employed, and the number of victims involved made their case unique in American criminal history. The trial proceedings were covered extensively in newspapers throughout the Midwest, and the case became a subject of study for criminologists and legal scholars. The immediate aftermath of the discovery created serious problems for the community of Hayes. The brothers' activities had resulted in the loss of a significant portion of the town's population, and many property ownership records had been falsified or destroyed. Legal proceedings continued for years as authorities attempted to determine the rightful owners of properties that had been illegally transferred. The case also raised difficult questions about community responsibility and the systems that had allowed such crimes to go undetected. Many residents struggled with guilt over their failure to recognize the signs of the brothers' activities, and some blamed themselves for trusting the brothers despite subtle warning signs. Dr. Hartwell, who had played a crucial role in exposing the brothers, was profoundly affected by the experience. His medical journal entries from the period reveal a man grappling with the psychological impact of discovering such systematic evil within his community. He continued to practice medicine in Hayes, but never fully recovered from the trauma of the investigation. Janet Thornfield, the boarding house operator who had first suspected the brothers, became something of a local hero for her persistence in investigating their activities. However, she also struggled with the knowledge that her earlier intervention might have saved lives. She continued to live in Hayes until her death in 1934, always maintaining detailed records of community activities and remaining vigilant for signs of similar crimes. The case had broader implications for law enforcement and community oversight. It demonstrated how extreme circumstances could provide cover for criminal activity and highlighted the importance of maintaining official oversight even during crisis situations. The case became a subject of study in policemies and legal schools, used as an example of how systematic criminals could exploit community trust and extreme circumstances. Despite the extensive investigation, trial proceedings, and years of subsequent research, many questions about the Parker brothers' crimes remain unanswered. The true number of victims may never be known as the brothers. Records were incomplete, and much evidence was destroyed in their furnace. Some estimates suggest that the number of victims could have been significantly higher than the 47 families mentioned in Thomas Parker's confession. The brothers' backgrounds and the origins of their criminal behavior remain mysterious. Despite extensive investigation, authorities were never able to determine definitively whether the brothers had committed similar crimes before arriving in Hayes, or whether their activities were solely the result of the extreme conditions of the winter of 1899. Some evidence suggests that they may have been involved in suspicious activities in other locations, but no definitive connections were ever established. The fate of some families remains unknown. While the brothers confessed to killing 47 families, records suggest that additional families disappeared during the winter without explanation. Some of these families may have died from natural causes or fled to other locations, but the possibility remains that the brothers' activities were even more extensive than they admitted. The psychological aspects of the case continue to fascinate researchers and criminologists. The brothers' ability to maintain their facade of respectability while committing systematic murder raises questions about the nature of evil and the factors that can lead ordinary individuals to commit extraordinary crimes. Their use of religious and charitable justifications for their actions provides insight into the psychological mechanisms that criminals use to rationalize their behavior. The case also raises broader questions about the nature of community and the systems that bind societies together. The residents of Hayes had trusted the Parker brothers based on their reputation and apparent respectability, demonstrating how criminals can exploit social trust and community bonds to facilitate their crimes. The Parker brothers were executed on the 15th of October, 1900, at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. Their deaths brought legal closure to one of the most horrific crime sprees in American history, but the impact of their actions continued to reverberate through the community of Hayes and the broader region for decades. The case remains one of the most extensively documented examples of systematic murder in American criminal history. The surviving records, including court transcripts, witness testimonies, and physical evidence, provide a comprehensive picture of how two individuals were able to exploit extreme circumstances to commit crimes of unprecedented scope and brutality. The story of the Parker brothers serves as a reminder of the potential for evil that exists within seemingly normal communities and the importance of maintaining vigilance even during times of crisis. Their crimes demonstrated how quickly social bonds can break down under extreme pressure and how criminals can exploit community trust to facilitate their activities. Today, the site of the Parker brothers' warehouse in Hayes, Kansas, is marked by a simple memorial to the victims of their crimes. The memorial serves as a reminder of the importance of community vigilance and the need to protect vulnerable members of society, even during times of extreme hardship. The case continues to be studied by criminologists, historians, and legal scholars as an example of how extreme circumstances can provide cover for criminal activity and how communities can work together to expose and stop such crimes. The investigation that led to the brothers' capture demonstrates the importance of citizen involvement in law enforcement and the power of community action in the face of evil. This story reminds us that even in the darkest moments of human history, there are always individuals willing to stand up for justice and protect their communities. The courage of Janet Thornfield, Dr. Hartwell, and the other investigators who exposed the Parker brothers' crimes serves as an inspiration for all who face difficult moral choices in their own lives. Even after the brothers' execution, disturbing discoveries continued to surface throughout Hayes and the surrounding areas. In March 1901, nearly a year after the trials concluded, construction workers renovating the basement of the old Methodist church found a collection of personal items that had been hidden beneath the floorboards. The cache included jewelry, family photographs, children's toys, and religious artifacts that matched descriptions of belongings from families the Parker brothers had claimed to process. The most chilling discovery was a leather-bound ledger that appeared to contain detailed records of the brothers' activities dating back to 1897, 2 years before the infamous winter. The ledger entries were written in a coded system that took investigators months to decipher, but once translated, they revealed that the brothers had been systematically eliminating isolated families for far longer than anyone had suspected. According to the coded entries, the brothers had killed at least 15 families during the winters of 1897 and 1898, perfecting their methods and building their confidence before the massive killing spree of 1899. The entries describe their techniques in clinical detail, including how they had learned to dispose of bodies completely, how to forge property documents, and how to manipulate community perceptions of their activities. The ledger also contained disturbing psychological insights into the brothers' mindset. Thomas Parker had written extensive justifications for their actions, describing their victims as burdens on society and claiming that they were performing natural selection by eliminating the weak and vulnerable. Samuel Parker's entries were more practical, focusing on the logistics of their operations and the financial benefits of their crimes. Most horrifying were the entries that described the brothers' experiments with different killing methods. They had tested various approaches to murder, seeking methods that would be efficient, quiet, and leave minimal evidence. The ledger revealed that they had initially used poison obtained from agricultural supplies, but had eventually settled on suffocation and blunt force trauma as their preferred techniques. The discovery of the ledger forced authorities to reopen their investigation and reconsider the full scope of the brothers' crimes. The revelation that they had been killing families for at least 3 years meant that the total number of victims could have been well over 300 people, making their case one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in American history. As news of the additional evidence spread, several individuals came forward with stories that provided new insights into the brothers' activities. These testimonies, collected by state investigators between 1901 and 1903, painted a picture of a criminal enterprise that had operated with shocking efficiency and deception. Margaret Kowalski, the sole survivor of the family that Dr. Hartwell and Janet Thornfield had seen being taken to the warehouse, provided the most detailed account of the brothers' methods. Margaret had been visiting relatives in Junction City when her family was eliminated, and she returned to Hayes in spring 1900 to find that her entire family had supposedly died of exposure. Her testimony revealed that the brothers had been planning her family's elimination for months, waiting for the right opportunity when she would be absent. According to Margaret, the brothers had visited her family repeatedly during the autumn of 1899, offering assistance with winter preparations and gradually gaining her family's trust. They had provided her family with contaminated heating fuel that burned inefficiently, forcing them to depend on the brothers for additional supplies. They had also spread rumors in town that the Kowalski family was suffering from a contagious disease, isolating them from potential help. Margaret's testimony also revealed that the brothers had been systematically poisoning isolated families with small doses of arsenic obtained from agricultural supplies. This poison weakened their victims and made them more susceptible to cold and disease, creating conditions that would make their deaths appear natural. The brothers would then offer to help the weakened families, ultimately luring them to the warehouse for elimination. Another crucial testimony came from Henry Kellerman, Mary Kellerman's brother, who had worked briefly as a part-time employee for the Parker brothers during the winter of 1899. Henry had been hired to help with what he believed was legitimate estate clearing work, but he had witnessed activities that had troubled him at the time and terrified him once he understood their true nature. Henry described being present when the brothers processed the belongings of recently eliminated families. He had watched them sort through personal items with cold efficiency, separating valuable objects from sentimental possessions. The brothers had shown particular interest in family photographs and documents, which they would study carefully before burning them in their furnace. Most disturbing was Henry's account of the brothers' conversations during these sessions. They would discuss their victims with casual indifference, referring to them by their property values rather than their names. Thomas Parker would often comment on the efficiency of their operations, expressing satisfaction with how cleanly they had eliminated entire families without leaving evidence. Henry also provided details about the brothers' disposal methods. He had helped them carry what he believed were bundles of contaminated clothing and bedding to the furnace, but he now realized that these bundles had likely contained human remains. The brothers had been meticulous about ensuring that nothing identifiable survived the burning process, often grinding down bone fragments and mixing them with ash before disposal. The revelation of the full scope of the Parker brothers' crimes created a crisis of faith within the community of Hayes. Residents struggled to understand how such systematic evil could have operated in their midst for years without detection. The discovery that the brothers had eliminated families for 3 years before their massive killing spree of 1899 raised painful questions about community responsibility and the warning signs that had been ignored. Church leaders organized special prayer services and community meetings to help residents process the trauma of the revelations. The Methodist minister, Reverend William Hartwell, Dr. Hartwell's brother, delivered a series of sermons about the nature of evil and the importance of community vigilance. These sermons, preserved in the church archives, provide insight into how a religious community grappled with the existence of such systematic evil within their midst. The economic impact of the crimes also continued to reverberate throughout the region. The brothers had illegally acquired vast amounts of property and possessions, creating a complex web of false ownership that took years to untangle. Many legitimate property owners had to engage in lengthy legal battles to reclaim their rightful possessions, and some properties were never successfully returned to their original owners. The case also had broader implications for frontier communities throughout the American West. The Parker brothers' crimes demonstrated how isolated communities could be vulnerable to systematic predators who exploited the trust and mutual dependence that frontier life required. Other communities began implementing new procedures for monitoring estate services and tracking population changes to prevent similar crimes. State authorities established new protocols for investigating suspicious deaths and disappearances in rural areas. These protocols required multiple witnesses for death certifications, mandatory medical examinations of bodies, and detailed documentation of property transfers. The Parker Protocols, as they became known, were adopted by several Western states and remained in use for decades. The Parker brothers' case became a subject of intense interest for the emerging field of criminal psychology. Dr. Alienist Hamilton Craig, who had been studying criminal behavior at the University of Kansas, conducted extensive interviews with surviving witnesses and analyzed the brothers' writings and behavior patterns. His findings, published in 1904, provided one of the first comprehensive psychological profiles of systematic murderers. Dr. Craig's analysis revealed that the Parker brothers had displayed classic signs of what would later be termed psychopathic behavior. They had demonstrated a complete lack of empathy for their victims, viewing them as objects to be exploited rather than human beings with inherent value. Their ability to maintain facades of respectability while committing systematic murder indicated sophisticated psychological manipulation skills. The brothers had also shown remarkable adaptability in their criminal methods, constantly refining their techniques based on experience and changing circumstances. This adaptability, combined with their long-term planning abilities, suggested high intelligence and organizational skills that had been channeled toward criminal purposes. Most intriguingly, Dr. Craig's analysis suggested that the brothers had developed a shared delusion that justified their actions. They had convinced themselves that they were performing a beneficial service by eliminating families who would otherwise suffer slow deaths from starvation and exposure. This psychological mechanism had allowed them to commit mass murder while maintaining positive self-I-am images. The brothers' writings also revealed a gradual escalation in their criminal thinking. Their earliest entries showed some awareness that their actions were wrong, but later entries demonstrated complete moral detachment from their crimes. This progression provided insight into how individuals might gradually become desensitized to extreme violence through repeated exposure and psychological justification. Dr. Craig's work on the Parker brothers case contributed to the development of early criminal psychology theories and influenced how law enforcement approached the investigation of systematic crimes. His findings suggested that criminals like the Parker brothers could be identified through careful observation of their behavior patterns and psychological characteristics. The most shocking discovery related to the Parker brothers' crimes didn't surface until 1907, nearly 7 years after their execution. During the demolition of an old barn on the outskirts of Hayes, workers found a hidden chamber that contained additional evidence of the brothers' activities. The chamber had been carefully concealed behind a false wall and contained items that provided new insights into the full scope of their crimes. The hidden chamber contained hundreds of personal items that had belonged to the brothers' victims, including jewelry, photographs, religious artifacts, and family documents. The items were organized with meticulous care, suggesting that the brothers had maintained this collection as some form of trophy room or memorial to their crimes. Most disturbing were the detailed maps and diagrams that showed the locations of unmarked graves throughout the region. These documents revealed that the brothers had not always used their furnace to dispose of bodies. In some cases, they had buried victims in remote locations, marking the grave sites for future reference. The maps led investigators to 17 additional burial sites containing the remains of 43 individuals. The discovery of these graves provided final confirmation of the true scope of the Parker brothers' crimes. Forensic analysis of the remains revealed that the brothers had been killing families for at least 4 years before their capture, eliminating an estimated total of over 400 victims. This number made their case one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in world history. The grave sites also provided evidence of the brothers' psychological deterioration over time. Earlier burials showed some attempt at respectful treatment of the bodies, but later graves revealed increasingly callous disposal methods. The brothers had gradually abandoned any pretense of human dignity in their treatment of victims, reflecting their complete moral detachment from their crimes. The Parker brothers' case had profound and lasting effects on American society, law enforcement, and criminal justice. The systematic nature of their crimes and the sophisticated methods they employed challenged existing assumptions about criminal behavior and community safety. The case demonstrated that extreme evil could exist within seemingly normal communities and that traditional social safeguards might be insufficient to prevent such crimes. The legal proceedings that followed the brothers' execution established important precedents for handling cases involving systematic murder and property fraud. The complex web of false property transfers and forged documents required new legal frameworks for restoring stolen property to rightful owners. These frameworks influenced property law and estate procedures for decades. The case also had significant impact on the development of law enforcement techniques. The investigation that exposed the brothers' crimes demonstrated the importance of community cooperation in solving complex criminal cases. The success of the citizen investigators who first suspected the brothers helped establish the principle that community members have both the right and responsibility to report suspicious activities to authorities. The psychological analysis of the Parker brothers contributed to the early development of criminal profiling techniques. Dr. Craig's work provided a foundation for understanding how systematic murderers think and operate, influencing how law enforcement approached similar cases in the future. The case became a standard example in criminal psychology courses and police training programs. The community of Hayes itself was forever changed by the revelation of the brothers' crimes. The town's population had been devastated by the murders, and many survivors struggled with trauma and guilt for decades. The community developed new traditions and institutions designed to preserve the memory of the victims and prevent similar crimes from occurring. A memorial park was established on the site of the Parker Brothers warehouse, featuring monuments to the victims and educational displays about the importance of community vigilance. The park became a place of remembrance and reflection, helping the community process the trauma of the crimes and honor the memory of those who had died. Despite extensive investigation, prosecution, and ongoing research, some aspects of the Parker Brothers case remain mysterious. The true number of victims may never be known, as the brothers' records were incomplete and much evidence was destroyed. Some estimates suggest that the number could have been even higher than the confirmed 400 victims, making their case possibly the most extensive serial killing spree in human history. The brothers' backgrounds and the origins of their criminal behavior remain partially unclear. Despite extensive investigation, authorities were never able to determine definitively whether the brothers had committed similar crimes before arriving in Kansas, or whether their activities were solely the result of the opportunities they found in frontier communities. Some evidence suggests that they may have been involved in suspicious activities in other locations, but no definitive connections were ever established. The psychological mechanisms that allowed the brothers to commit such systematic murder while maintaining facades of respectability continue to fascinate researchers. Their ability to live dual lives, appearing as helpful community members while secretly eliminating families, raises questions about the nature of evil and the factors that can lead individuals to commit extraordinary crimes. The case also raises broader questions about the nature of community and the systems that bind societies together. The residents of Hayes had trusted the Parker brothers based on their reputation and apparent respectability, demonstrating how criminals can exploit social trust and community bonds to facilitate their crimes. The case serves as a reminder that vigilance and skepticism are necessary even in close-knit communities. The winter of 1,899 inches Kansas was indeed the coldest on record. But the actions of the Parker brothers created a cold that went far deeper than any temperature, a cold that touched the very soul of a community and reminded everyone that evil can lurk behind the most respectable facades. What they burned in their furnace was indeed more than wood. It was human life, human dignity, and the trust that binds communities together. Yet, the story of the Parker brothers is not ultimately about the triumph of evil, but about the power of community vigilance and individual courage to expose and stop even the most systematic crimes. The investigation that led to their capture demonstrates that ordinary citizens working together with determination and courage can overcome even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises. The case serves as a permanent reminder that freedom and safety require constant vigilance, and that each member of a community has a responsibility to protect vulnerable members of society. The courage of Janet Thornfield, Dr. Hartwell, and the other investigators who exposed the Parker brothers' crimes continues to inspire those who face difficult moral choices in their own lives. Today, more than a century after the Parker brothers' execution, their case remains one of the most studied examples of systematic murder in criminal history. The lessons learned from their crimes continue to influence law enforcement, criminal psychology, and community safety practices. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest moments of human history, truth and justice can ultimately prevail over the most calculated evil. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Hayes intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the annals of American crime. This mystery shows us that evil can hide behind the most respectable facades, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there might be more victims whose stories will never be told? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The truth is always more terrifying than fiction, and there are more stories waiting to be uncovered. See you in the next video.